The date was September 7th, 1945. The ruins of Berlin were still smoldering, the air thick with the smell of ash, crushed brick, and the lingering stench of death. World War II in Europe was officially over, but a new war was already beginning. On this day, the Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, gathered in the shattered heart of the German capital for a grand victory parade. It was supposed to be a display of unity, a celebration of the alliance that had crushed Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. But behind the forced smiles, the salutes, and the diplomatic handshakes, there was a simmering, venomous hatred. Standing on the reviewing stand was American General George S. Patton, famous for his ivory-handled revolvers, his polished boots, and his foul mouth. Patton was arguably the greatest battlefield commander the United States had ever produced. But Patton was not in a celebratory mood. He despised the Soviets. He believed the United States had fought the wrong enemy, and that they should rearm the surrendered Germans and march straight to Moscow. And then he saw him. Stepping out of a staff car was Marshal Zhukov, the supreme commander of the Soviet Red Army, the man who had broken the back of the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad in Kursk and the conqueror of Berlin. Zhukov emerged wearing a parade uniform that was almost blinding. His broad chest was absolutely covered from shoulder to waist with thick rows of glittering Soviet medals, gold stars, and massive jeweled orders. He walked with the heavy, arrogant swagger of a man who knew he had just won the biggest war in human history. Patton stared at the Soviet legend. He took a drag from his cigar, his eyes narrowing with pure, unfiltered disgust. He didn't see an ally. He didn't see a hero. He saw a communist barbarian dressed up in a clown suit. Patton leaned over to one of his aides, a smirk playing on his lips, and muttered a phrase that perfectly captured the dawn of the Cold War. What Patton said in that moment, and what he did during that fateful meeting with Zhukov, was not just an insult. It was a diplomatic disaster that would ultimately cost Patton his career, and perhaps his life.
To understand the explosive nature of this encounter, you have to understand the two men involved. They were, in many ways, identical mirrors of each other, yet separated by an impenetrable ideological wall. Georgy Zhukov was a peasant who had risen through the brutal, paranoid ranks of Joseph Stalin's military. He survived the Great Purges of the 1930s, a time when Stalin executed tens of thousands of his own officers by proving himself to be utterly ruthless and brilliant. Zhukov did not care about casualties. If he had to send 100,000 men to their deaths to take a heavily fortified German position, he would do it without blinking. He was the hammer of the Soviet Union. By 1945, he was the most decorated military officer in Russian history. The medals on his chest were not just pieces of metal. They were bought with the blood of millions of Soviet soldiers. George S. Patton, on the other hand, was an aristocrat. He came from a wealthy military family, believed in reincarnation, and thought he was destined by God to achieve glorious victories on the battlefield.
Like Zhukov, Patton was aggressive, completely uncompromising, and demanded absolute perfection from his men. But while Zhukov fought for the survival of the communist state, Patton fought for personal glory and his fierce belief in Western democratic ideals. Patton was a showman. He wore a custom-tailored uniform, a shiny brass helmet, and carried 2 ivory-handled revolvers at his hips. He understood the theater of war. But despite his own flamboyant style, Patton had a deep, visceral hatred for the Soviet Union. As the war in Europe drew to a close in the spring of 1945, Patton's Third Army was tearing through Germany at a breakneck pace. Patton wanted to keep going. He wanted to race the Soviets to Berlin, take the German capital, and push the Red Army out of Eastern Europe. He famously pleaded with the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, to let him advance. "We have a highly mechanized army," Patton argued. "Let's keep going. Let's drive the Russians back to the border." But Eisenhower was playing a political game. The politicians in Washington and London had already agreed at the Yalta Conference to divide Germany into occupation zones. Berlin belonged to the Soviet zone. Eisenhower ordered Patton to halt his advance and let the Red Army take the city. Patton was furious. He watched in disgust as Zhukov's forces surrounded Berlin, subjecting it to one of the most brutal, destructive artillery bombardments in history, followed by an occupation characterized by mass looting and atrocities. To Patton, the Soviets were not liberators. They were an Asian horde, a plague that was replacing one dictatorship with another. By the time the two generals finally met face-to-face in the late summer and fall of 1945, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Patton had been appointed the military governor of Bavaria in the American occupation zone, but he was completely unsuited for peacetime diplomacy. He openly criticized the denazification process, arguing that keeping former Nazi administrators in their jobs was the only way to keep the infrastructure running and prevent Europe from collapsing into communist revolution. His outspoken views terrified the politicians back in Washington. They wanted peace with Stalin. Patton wanted World War III. This was the powder keg that existed when the Allied leaders gathered in Berlin for the Victory Parade on September 7th. The parade was proposed by Zhukov himself. It was meant to be a showcase of Allied military might, with American, British, French, and Soviet troops marching together past the Brandenburg Gate. But behind the scenes, it was a giant flexing of muscles. The Western Allies sent a few thousand troops and some light armored vehicles. The Soviets, however, decided to put on a terrifying display of force. They brought out their new IS-3 heavy tanks, massive steel beasts with sloping armor and massive guns that made the American Sherman tanks look like fragile toys. It was a clear message to the West: we are here, we are powerful, and you cannot move us. When Zhukov arrived at the reviewing stand, he made sure he was the center of attention. The Soviet marshal stepped out in his full dress uniform. The Soviet style for top commanders was incredibly ostentatious. Zhukov's chest was literally a shield of gold, silver, and colorful ribbons. He wore the massive platinum and diamond-encrusted Order of Victory, the gold stars of the hero of the Soviet Union, and dozens of other heavy metals that clinked and shined in the sunlight. He looked like an emperor. Patton, standing nearby, watched Zhukov's grand entrance. Patton himself was wearing his shiny helmet, his custom jacket, and his revolvers, but compared to Zhukov, he looked almost understated. Patton leaned over to Major General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, and didn't bother to lower his voice. "Look at that," Patton said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "He's in a full-dress uniform, and he looks like a comic opera marshal of a South American army." Patton didn't stop there. Later, when writing in his diary and in letters to his wife, Beatrice, he elaborated on his total disdain for the Soviet commander and his decorations. Patton wrote, "The medals the Russians wear are of no value. They look like they were bought at a county fair or a cheap 5-and-dime store. Zhukov had enough medals to sink a ship. If he fell in the river, he would drown instantly from the weight of his own vanity." It was a classic Patton insult, sharp, funny, and utterly disrespectful. But Patton's hatred went far beyond Zhukov's fashion sense. Throughout the day, as they watched the troops march by, Patton's disgust only grew. He looked at the Soviet soldiers, many of them hardened, brutalized peasants from the deep steppes of Russia who had survived the slaughterhouse of the Eastern Front. Patton did not see brave allies. In his diary, he wrote, "The Russian soldiers look like a recently civilized Mongol horde. They are a scurvy race and simply savages. We could beat the hell out of them." The animosity between the two camps almost boiled over during the official banquets and diplomatic dinners that followed these military parades. There is a legendary story, corroborated by several officers present during this period, about a banquet hosted by the Soviets. These banquets were notoriously intense. The Russians would propose toast after toast after toast, drinking massive glasses of pure vodka. It was a psychological game to see if the Western officers could hold their liquor and maintain their composure.
At one of these dinners, Zhukov stood up, raised his glass, and proposed a toast to the Allied victory and to the health of the commanders. The translator repeated the toast in English. Patton, who was seated at the table, stood up slowly. He grabbed his glass, looked directly at the Soviet general, and spoke in his high-pitched, aristocratic voice. "Tell that Russian son of a bitch," Patton said to the translator, "that from the way he's drinking, I figure he wants to fight. And if he wants to fight, I will oblige him right now." The translator went pale. You did not speak to Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's favorite general, in that manner. The translator hesitated, terrified of starting an international incident. Patton slammed his fist on the table. "Translated exactly as I said it," he roared. The trembling translator turned to Zhukov and translated Patton's words. The room went dead silent. American and Soviet officers reached for their weapons under the table. The tension was electric. Zhukov stared at Patton. His face was unreadable. Then, suddenly, Zhukov burst into a loud, booming laugh. He raised his glass higher, looking Patton right in the eye.
"Tell the American general," Zhukov replied through the translator, "that if he wants a fight, the Red Army is ready to give him one he will never forget. But for tonight, we drink." Patton smirked. He respected a man who pushed back. The two generals clinked their glasses and downed the vodka. It was a moment of mutual respect between two apex predators, but it was also a terrifying glimpse into the future. They weren't just two generals trading insults. They were the physical embodiments of the United States and the Soviet Union, sizing each other up for the next war. But Patton's inability to keep his mouth shut and his blatant hostility toward the Soviets was becoming a massive liability for the United States. Eisenhower was furious with his old friend. Washington was desperately trying to negotiate the post-war order with Stalin. They were trying to establish the United Nations. They needed the Soviets to enter the war against Japan in the Pacific. The last thing they needed was a rogue American general trying to start World War III in the ruins of Germany.
The press soon caught wind of Patton's behavior and his controversial statements regarding the denazification of Bavaria. Patton had told reporters that the difference between the Nazis and the anti-Nazis was like the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans back home, a statement that caused absolute outrage in the United States. He continued to complain loudly that America had destroyed what could have been a good race, and we are about to replace them with Mongolian savages. Eisenhower realized he had no choice. Patton was a brilliant wartime commander, but he was a terrible peacetime diplomat. In October 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of his beloved Third Army. It was a humiliating blow. Patton was transferred to the 15th Army, a paper command tasked with writing the history of the war. For a man of action, a man who believed he was born to conquer, it was a fate worse than death. Patton was deeply depressed. He felt betrayed by Eisenhower and his own government. He firmly believed that the United States was making a catastrophic mistake by trusting the Soviets.
In his final diary entries, he wrote with chilling prophecy, "We have won a series of battles, but we have not won the war for peace. We have handed over half of Europe to a tyranny far worse than the one we just defeated. The politicians do not understand the Russian. I do. We will have to fight them eventually, and by waiting, we are only giving them time to build their strength." He was, of course, entirely correct. Within a few short years, the Iron Curtain would descend across Europe. The Cold War would begin, bringing the world to the very brink of nuclear annihilation. The Soviets would become America's greatest enemy for the next half-century, but Patton would not live to see it. On December 9, 1945, just a day before he was scheduled to fly back to the United States, Patton was involved in a bizarre, low-speed car crash near Mannheim, Germany. A military truck inexplicably turned directly into the path of his Cadillac staff car. Everyone else in the vehicle was unhurt, but Patton was thrown forward, breaking his neck and paralyzing him from the neck down. He lingered in a hospital for 12 days before dying of an embolism on December 21st. His sudden, strange death immediately sparked conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Did the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, assassinate him to keep him from returning to America and campaigning against the Soviet alliance? Did Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, arrange the crash to eliminate the one Western general who truly understood the communist threat and wanted to fight them? Or was it simply a tragic, random accident that took the life of America's greatest warrior? We may never know the absolute truth of Patton's death, but what we do know is that his encounter with Georgy Zhukov in Berlin was one of the defining moments of the 20th century. When Patton looked at Zhukov's chest full of medals and called him a comic opera marshal, he wasn't just insulting a rival officer. He was expressing the deep, irreconcilable difference between the free world and the Soviet Empire. Patton saw through the illusion of the Grand Alliance. He knew that the victory over Nazi Germany was not the end of the struggle, but merely the prologue to a much longer, darker conflict. As the decades of the Cold War dragged on, with proxy wars, nuclear standoffs, and the division of the world into two hostile camps, many military men in the Pentagon would look back at the autumn of 1945 and wonder quietly to themselves, was George S. Patton right? Should they have listened to the crazy general with the ivory-handled revolvers? Should they have marched on Moscow when they had the chance? Patton and Zhukov, the two titans of the Second World War, never met on the battlefield, but their clash of wills in the shattered streets of Berlin set the stage for the next 50 years of human history. They were enemies disguised as allies, drinking vodka and plotting each other's destruction, standing on the ashes of a destroyed world, waiting for the next war to begin.